Hi, Ben.
Hi, Sam. How are you?
Oh, we need a new first question in these times. What are you drinking?
What am I drinking? Okay.
What are you drinking? Why does everybody assume this invitation is a cocktail invitation?
Cocktail invitation. I'm drinking. I'm unofficially sponsored by St. George Spirits in Alameda, California, and I'm drinking my favorite Amaro that they make, the Bruto Americano, mixed with a little soda, and I think I have a little zest of orange. Thank you guys at St. George Spirits. Official.
This is great. Everybody seems to have preserved zest for their cocktail making. And I devoured all of my zestable is not a word. It's like all the oranges and lemons are gone. It's just like what's that poem? I'm writing to tell you that I've eaten the plums.
Oh, the William Carlos William, yeah.
Yeah, and the oranges and the limes and the lemons.
They need to send a big ship filled with citrus up the Hudson to reach you.
That would be lovely.
Yeah.
I poured myself a glass of red wine.
Oh, good.
It's from the Rhine, and it's really thank you for taking the time to talk to me and for taking the time to participate in this audio visual recording experience to create a record of this moment that we're all grappling with and wrestling with in a way, not yet knowing how it's going to dramatically change the world. We've been thrown into this kind of flux moment. And when I was thinking about people to talk with, to think with in these dark times, I thought about your book, which I've been reading for the past week, on thinking in public. And you write about Arendt and Levinas and Strauss. And so I know Arendt is somebody that you think with, and I wanted to just start with a question that I'm asking everyone. And then we can see where the conversation goes. But in the Life of the Mind, Hannah Arendt asks this question: where are we when we think? And so where are you in the world right now? How are you doing? And how is this moment affecting your thinking as somebody who's thought intensely about thinking as an activity itself?
Yeah. Well, really, Sam, I'm honored that you're reading my book, and really delighted to be in conversation with you. I'm physically sitting in a bedroom that I rent in Northampton, Massachusetts. I'm at my best friend's house. She lives out here in Northampton. And I spend most of my time in Cambridge, my hometown. And I teach this year down at Wesleyan in Middletown, Connecticut, which is not so far by car from Northampton. So I spend a significant amount of time going between here and there, and I decided to hunker down for at least the first couple weeks of being sequestered here, in part because it's a rural area and it's easy to create distance. It's also really easy to create space for one of the ways that Hannah Arendt describes thinking as an activity done in solitude. And I know that you think a lot about the difference in Arendt's thought between loneliness and solitude, and I'd love to hear more from you on that in the conversation. But to answer more of your question, we are now, depending on what timeline you're on, either months or weeks, months from a global perspective, weeks from a North American perspective, into the crisis around the pandemic of the novel strain of coronavirus, COVID-19, which a mutual friend of ours always hears as Corvid-19, which is kind of rather poetic, purposeful mishearing of
Yes.
crows or ravens flying around us. So what I find myself thinking as I read the news, and am generally, to be very honest, quite afraid about what will happen.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I keep thinking is this a kind of a non-Arendtian crisis? And I want to be a little provocative when I say that, because the Arendt of the human condition doesn't have a high opinion of technical experts and
No.
of technical expertise. And this is a time in which we need tons of technical expertise, and we need the mechanisms that we're calling social distancing. We need the advice of epidemiologists. We do not need the blatherings of a political figure who thinks that we should have full churches on April 12th on Easter. So when I say non-Arendtian, I'm sort of
talking about. I must have missed that.
Oh, you're luckier than me. So the question of sort of would Hannah Arendt find herself arguing against herself in this crisis? That was on my mind today.
Huh. Yeah. I have been wondering how, in that vein, I've been wondering with your book about how Arendt's distinction between private and public might be radically shifted in this moment. If we need to appear in the public realm in order to speak and in order to act, in order to be fully human, she says. And right now we've been so radically turned in to the space of the home, to the private sphere. And yet here we are in this very, gray space. We know one another privately. We both appear publicly in our writing. And this will be posted on a social media platform. It's a private conversation in a lot of ways, but it's also a conversation that we both know is going to be heard by other people. And so I'm wrestling with the fungibility, the porosity, to use the Benjamin word, of her distinctions between the different realms of life, and how we can be fully human in this state, in this crisis. And that, I think that's where she starts to talk about loneliness too, and how we, when we're cut off from the world and we don't have the ability to appear in public, and she's writing under different conditions. She's writing at a different historical moment. She's writing before the advent of these mediums. How do you see those distinctions changing with our historical moment and the material conditions that are shaping our time now?
Well, as you're talking, I get the sense that you're layering on one another two different things that are related, but just to try to tease them apart. On the one hand, there's the way in which the internet and the culture around media use shapes writing right now for our generation of writers and intellectuals and scholars and academics. And then there's the very unforeseen by many change in daily life over the last few weeks here in North America.
Yeah.
And those are different, but they're sort of piling on top of one another right now. So in a kind of a you know, selfish, navel-gazing, omphaloskeptic, that's the Greek for navel-gazing, right? The omphaloskeptic way. I think that my life hasn't changed that much, except that I don't go to cafes.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And I write and I go for runs and I do yoga. Only now I'm doing it in front of a computer instead of in a yoga studio. And I'm not going on group bike rides. I'm staying home, and I'm aided a little bit by the weather because we're sort of in early spring still, but we had snow here a couple of days ago, as I think you did too.
Yes.
And um, there's a way in which I don't feel as though my relationship with the public world has changed that much. On the other hand, our sense of what the public is might be changed, just to try to follow your line of thought, by our sheer consciousness that other people aren't gathering in sidewalk cafes in Europe or in bars in New York City, that many public spaces of congregation have been necessarily closed down. And maybe even when we continue to inhabit routines like mine, there's still some consciousness that public life has been curtailed in really important ways.
Yeah. So I think to pick up on two things in that, one is, you know, it's funny to right now to experience the beginning of spring all around us, and to be indoors, to have a sense of feeling of being inside in a certain way. And you used the word congregation, which made me think of the Congress of the Birds.
Yeah.
But so we're experiencing this global event that is affecting everybody in some way, and that has never happened in our lifetime before. So that's an interesting idea of a public experience, maybe, that's being shared. I'm not sure. But then also you know, you are talking about all these activities that you're still able to engage in, that are being mediated by technology, that are part of your established routine anyway, that give you an ability to navigate everyday life. But, you know, at the end of this conversation, when I stop recording and we're not talking to each other anymore, you know, like, I'm not there and you're not here, or you're not leaving the yoga studio with other people, you're not on the group bike ride. So how does that fundamentally change experience?
I mean, there's a very basic question here that maybe has very little to do with Hannah Arendt or with political philosophy, which is, what's the difference between exiting a chat and an application and exiting a room?
Yeah. Yes. Precisely. And the feeling and the energy and how that shapes our memory and the affective experience of an event.
So I don't know if you've taught via Zoom yet with students. I believe you have, and I have. I had my first experience with this on Monday, and one of the things that I experienced was this kind of exhaustion afterwards, which I hadn't expected.
Huh.
I don't know if this speaks to the question, but I want to work with it. And the feeling was that my attention had been split between the parts of the screen. Right now, I like to look people more or less in the eye when I'm speaking with them. I sort of am a direct looker of all the conversational styles. But in order to seem like I'm looking you in the eye right now, I'm looking at a green light. Because my attention is sort of split between the camera and the image of your face that's on my screen.
Yeah.
And little things like that, when I was teaching, made me, I think, tired. And it was more tiring than being in a physical space with other people.
Yeah.
And the same way, the yoga class ends and the teacher sort of waves by at us and says, "I look forward to seeing you soon. I hope we can all practice together in the same space soon." And uh, nobody's under any illusions that there's a direct equivalency between the space of the rooms we're in being linked to one another now via Zoom, and the actual experience of being in the same place.
Right. And I mean, this relates to another question that I want to ask you. So I'll ask you the two together. You know, one of the things that I love about thinking in public is the way that you frame it, wrestling with the idea that Arendt posits about philosophers being blinded um, in, through thinking and being able to come face to face with reality. And so I'm not sure how things unfolded, you know, for you in transitioning to a Zoom classroom, but to tie it to what you just said and to ask the question in another way, you know, I was really shocked by the number of conversations I had with people who I really respect, who were just absolutely unwilling, even up to like a week and a half ago, to acknowledge what was happening. And I'm wondering, what is it about our present moment that's creating that inability to reckon with what's in front of us? But then the other side of that is people seem to be operating on the assumption that, oh, I can just pick up my class and I'll teach it in Zoom and I'll teach it at the same time that I've been teaching it, and it'll be the same thing, and it'll just be on a digital platform. And and that seems totally unrealistic to me. It seems it not rooted in reality. It seems to almost willfully want to ignore and turn away from our present moment. So yeah, I mean, how are you? It's a lot of questions in one.
No, but it reminds me, and I do try to deal with this in my book, of Arendt's ambivalence about philosophers. And the big argument that I offer in the book is that in the late lectures that get published as The Life of the Mind, Arendt is recuperating philosophy for herself after decades of not wanting to call what she's doing philosophy, but that she does it by saying that the life of the mind, the title, is bigger than philosophy. You know, that there's thinking and philosophy is part of it, but it's actually willing and judging too. It's these things that involve the world and other people. There's a way in which I think Arendt always, throughout her career, thinks that professional thinkers can be so willfully blind to the world around them, can be so uninterested in realia. And sometimes it seems to me, and you are so much closer to this literature than I am, it seems to me that she sometimes views Heidegger's temporary affiliation with Nazism in these terms, that he's one of these people who can be so unworldly, even in his efforts to be worldly.
He's in his foxhole.
Thank you. Yes, he's in his. Sam, are there hedgehog holes? If there can be foxholes, can there also be hedgehog holes?
I honestly don't know enough about hedgehogs to have a witty response for you. I'm so sorry. I mean, I imagine that all appearing creatures who have any sense of conscious identity would be able to turn inward in a kind of hole of self affirmation.
Yeah.
You know, in a lot of ways, I think a lot of us have burrowed into our little comfy spaces, or you know, we've made little nests for ourselves, and we are reticent to often hop. Birds don't hop, to fly out of. I guess they could hop.
I think birds. Yeah, I mean, birds do all manner of things, including definitely hop. But I don't know if I don't think hedgehogs hop. But no. I was just, you know, she has that, she writes, calls him Heidegger the fox. Heidegger
Yes.
the fox, and he's in his foxhole. And but I was wondering, what's funny about it is that if we were to sort of turn to Isaiah Berlin's hedgehog and fox juxtaposition, and Hannah Arendt's presentation of Heidegger is much more a hedgehog than a fox. He knows one thing, or he tries to know one thing and know it really well. And Arendt, in her wonderful way, is the person who feels as though her intellect can encompass many things, and it can encompass things in the private life, and it can encompass things in public life. And I'm very cautious of ever saying Arendt thinks such and such, because I think that she goes through many moments in her career, and I think she really does disavow philosophy at certain points and then wants to recuperate it. And you must be so sensitive to this issue since you've been working on a much anticipated biography of her. But I think that one of the things that I saw, moving back to the other part of your question,
yes,
was many of my colleagues in a sort of informal faculty chat room by email, making brave noises about how successfully they would teach online, or how successfully we could teach online, and others making more what I think of as realistic noises about how this isn't what anyone signed up for. It's not what we know how to do. There are people who are actual experts in online education.
yes,
It's not something I ever wanted to be,
right,
because it's not a modality of education I was ever enthusiastic about. And pretending that we could provide something for our students that was sort of a continuity seemed disingenuous to me. And I much preferred the sort of noises of moderation and skepticism from colleagues who know that we're not used to this.
Yeah. Well, what is it, do you think, about this contemporary political moment that's preventing, I think, both some professional thinkers and some, everyday, people? I don't know how we would, I think I just got that from the Pulp song, Common People. I'm not sure. But, how do we, I don't like this distinction, honestly. It actually, I'm wrestling with the language, because I hate the distinction between like the professional thinking classes and like people who aren't professional thinkers. It seems to undermine in some way the importance of what it means to engage in the thinking activity itself for everyone. And the idea that we all are capable of making judgments. And I think that was part of Arendt's frustration with thinking about, what she always says is called them the professional thinkers. But what is it about this contemporary political moment that's stopping us from seeing what's happening? And why are some people so resistant to accept both personal moral responsibility, and what is it that's preventing people from having a sense of community right now in this kind of doubling down on individualism?
So I'm trying to summon an intelligent answer to your question, but I also have the lyrics to Common People running through my mind.
I'm so sorry. It's such
no, it's good. But it's juxtaposed against that line from Auden from 1932. Private faces in public places are wiser and nicer than public faces in private places.
And I was going to read that to you.
Okay, well, we should talk about it. We should talk about what that means.
You stole the poem I was going to read you.
No, I don't want to steal something. Okay.
No, it's wonderful. You sensed it coming.
She came from Spain. She had a thirst for knowledge. She studied art at St. Martin's College.
And that's where I caught her eye. All right. It's the musical portion of the program.
So I haven't even...
I don't sing.
people flee for good reason from my singing voice.
Oh, there was, can I tell you a quick story since we're on Arendt and poets kind of, for just to slip in, then we'll go back to the question. Jerome Cohn published this wonderful essay in Social Research last fall on the Bertolt Brecht controversy and Hannah Arendt. And toward the end of the essay, she apparently did sing. Toward the end of the essay, he recounts this story of one of her parties at 370 Riverside Drive, where at the mention of Brecht, she jumped up on the kitchen table, lifted her skirts, and sang from Three Penny Opera, sang Mac the Knife in German. And like Arendt singing Mac the Knife in German on a table is a, well, it's a happy thought.
All my needs are satisfied. You
for
don't need
me.
to talk about anything else.
I'm sorry. I thought you'd appreciate that story.
No, I appreciate it so much. I appreciate it so much. But the sort of question is why is, just to try to rephrase, you were asking me, why is our political moment so seemingly invulnerable to any kind of traction of any kind? Why are we so split by different kinds of radicalization and factionalism? Mm-hmm. Why are so many people capable of ignoring what seem to some of us like the facts on the ground? And you know, we're both trained as social scientists. You're a political scientist and I'm a historian, and neither of us is likely to buy any kind of monocausal explanation for why things are like they are. You know, it's amazing. It's sort of a story about the poverty of our attention span or our memory, how mere weeks ago we were, you know, depending on who we are, having anxieties about Warren dropping out of the race, about whether or not we would be able to take our anti-nausea pills and vote for Biden. You know, what kind of candidacy Sanders could have.
Yeah. Questions
like that. And that's not really in full view right now. What we're now looking at is an administration that seems to me almost, not even almost, but criminally incapable of handling our share of the global crisis.
Yes.
And to say that we're suddenly not even in the world of the ordinary character of our political incapacities as a country, where we were a few weeks ago. We're in a really different world. But our ability to respond in intelligent ways is hampered by some of the same things that hampered us. And that includes the legacy of the 2016 election, which for those of us on the left means a serious inability to imagine some kind of successful team building exercise with the mainstream of the Democratic Party, which is something that probably people need greater imaginative capacity because that's the kind of thing that we may very well need to engage in.
Yes.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about since thinking in public is about the character of public intellectual life. And in many ways, that book was simultaneously a study of these three students of Martin Heidegger, Emmanuel Levinas, Leo Strauss, and Hannah Arendt, and a kind of an intervention in conversations about the social function of intellectuals. Because the book takes as a common thread critical things all three of those people said about the figure of the intellectual as a social type in modern European intellectual history.
Yes.
And I think, maybe controversially, that Hannah Arendt and Leo Strauss, whose adversarial status is near legend in some circles, we're really very close together on the issue of the relationship between philosophy and politics.
Mm-hmm.
I can go into that, but the argument I make is that all three of those figures, both in their theoretical works and in their biographies, offer us warnings about having too confident a faith in the ability of people who might call themselves today public intellectuals to legislate in public. And instead, I push for what I think we might be better served by, which is an account of publicness, which I don't think we can ever avoid. I'm not arguing for a private intellectual life, but a form of public intellectual life that is based on the model of commentary rather than that of legislation.
Uh-huh. One of the things that you emphasize in thinking about Hannah Arendt's conception of the public is the embodiedness of appearing. And how do you see that distinction between commentary and conversation and dialogue, and between two people who are appearing before one another publicly, in contrast to this other idea of what it means to do public work? Does it relocate spatially the public for you in your imaginary? I mean, where's the space for the commentary, for the conversation, I guess, is the question, back to the where are we when we think.
I mean, I think that
Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I think I understand. To try to say it back to you, we're now in a conversation
Yeah.
that we have some expectation of sharing publicly. And we know that, to use a word I don't love, but it works, we're performing something. We're trying to have a serious conversation in which we exchange ideas. And there are other forms of public intellectual life in which people grab the mic and go and don't doubt themselves and don't engage in conversations in which they might turn out to be wrong and embrace the fact that they might be wrong in public.
Yeah.
And in the same way that hearing is a physical process and implies, in some ways, the sensitivity and vulnerability of the body to outside stimuli.
Mm-hmm.
Just so, I think it's good to share in public forms of intellectual life in which we can have conversations, learn new things, be curious, try to uncover things about each other's views that we may not see ourselves, to model conversation as something that can do more than, that just by its nature can do more than monologue can do. I mean, I'm a historian of ideas. I'm also an ethnographer, and the book I wrote after thinking in public was based on sort of laboratory ethnography with scientists. And I had lots and lots and lots of conversations in which I displayed my ignorance, and I displayed my ignorance in almost useful ways because it would bring people out. It would get people to share things with me that they might not otherwise. But it was also a sincere ignorance. I don't know that much about the scientific questions that were in play, which have to do with tissue culture. It's not terribly Arendtian, although at certain points it is. But I guess what I'm getting at is that the forms of shared intellectual life lived in public that I like better and that I'm more comfortable with are more like a conversation than they are like a TED Talk.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, so I'm really curious, what do you think is our kind of public resistance to ignorance and curiosity. I think, you know, even one of the strange things, at least for me, has felt politically strange after the 2016 election is a lot of public political talking heads have been like bemoaning the loss of expertise, you know, and there almost seems to be this desire for that concrete, clean, here's an answer for you kind of narrative. And you're drawing a sharp distinction between a certain kind of performance of public knowledge and engaging in the work of understanding, which is fundamentally, you know, without telos in a certain way, without an end. And I think, especially for Arendt, incredibly dialogic in practice.
So when you talk about, when you sort of refer to forms of public knowledge or assertions of expertise, can you get concrete? What kinds of expertise would you think of as an example?
So if we're thinking about our contemporary political crisis, and we're thinking about a desire, I think a lot of people right now want to feel comforted. They want to know what is happening. And I think it's been really interesting for the past week, for example, to watch Governor Cuomo of New York go on TV every day and say repetitively, I don't know, here's a doctor, and here's what I know, and to put up these nice, neat slideshows. And people have been responding really well to his performance of public knowledge, because it's giving us something to hold on to. It's in many ways the opposite of what Donald Trump is doing. And it's, you know, it seems, you know, almost perhaps like a positive example of where, you know, we do need, you know, certain forms of knowledge in order to navigate and to understand what's happening in part. But, you know, another example, I think, that would be more complicated, you know, it's hard for me not to immediately start thinking about dialectic of enlightenment, and because I've been teaching it this semester. But there's the great part at the beginning where Adorno, you know, he's giving us the conceptual framework for Enlightenment thinking, and he talks about the loss of joy and understanding, where everything is reduced to some kind of mathematical, knowable quantity, where even our thoughts, he says, our thinking becomes reified in itself. And so we, you know, algorithms, you know, treat us as known quantities that can be used in marketing to sell us back to ourselves in certain ways, right? And so we live in the society of that, you know, where this is very present, but it's also invisible. But people, it seems really hard to get somebody to sit down in a room and have a slow conversation about something like, I don't pick a topic, but, you know, and just, you know, where people are comfortable saying, I don't know, and asking questions. And there's this desire, I think, that we have for certainty that is constantly being disappointed, in part because it can never exist. And
yeah, well, maybe we might, I think it's good to distinguish, though, between the kind of ignorance that responsible scientific inquiry involves.
Right.
And the kind of false confidence that the deployment of scientific knowledge in public often entails. So, you know, I don't want to try to, you know, kind of call back to C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures about science and the humanities in the middle of the 20th century. suggest that these two things, that it's fruitful to juxtapose the two things and associate skepticism, critique, and the embrace of ignorance and commentary with humanistic work, and to associate false confidence and bad versions of expertise with the sciences, because I think that that's too cruel to the sciences. And I mean, this is sort of, I'm wearing my anthropologist of science hat as I say this, as you can tell, but a lot of this comes down to the public use of discourses of knowledge and expertise, rather than the things that are actually part of the intellectual fabric of the disciplines involved.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to be cautious when I approach these things. I'm not discomfited by Cuomo doing this, as much as I'm discomfited by Trump's false confidence.
Yes.
But I think that what happens that's very problematic is that because we live in the era of the worship of STEM, and people associate the STEM fields not with inquiry, but with the development of potentially profitable products and helping people get careers that pay for middle-class lives. STEM has been, I think, wrong-headedly conflated with a posture of confidence rather than a posture of skepticism and agnosticism.
Yeah.
And I think that gets something wrong. I mean, right now I've been involved in teaching the scientific revolution, and why is Dialectic of Enlightenment Horkheimer and Adorno's most Jewish book?
Is this a joke? Am I supposed to answer?
Of course it's a joke.
I ruined the joke. Well, why?
Because it involves an attack on bacon. I'm so sorry.
Bad.
I'm so sorry.
I blame you for that. You're making me laugh.
So my bad.
Yes.
I listen.
No, please. I'd much rather listen to you.
Oh, okay. So, but this is just to say that there's forms of sort of bad performative expertise in the humanities too, as we know so well, and
Right.
there are lots of people who display what should be false confidence all the time. And I do think that we need lots of expertise, and we need a certain kind of confidence in certain kinds of expertise right now on the part of the public.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we should turn that into craving a technocracy.
Well, so this raises so many questions. And since we were talking about Zoom teaching a few minutes ago, one of the things that a lot of people have been speculating about is the future of higher education after the pandemic. Has there been phraseology invented for the after period, APAC, after Corona, or after COVID?
Yeah.
I don't know. But a lot of people have been speculating about what might happen, and whether or not institutions which will realize, it's cheaper to hire faculty to teach remotely, or, all of these idea, about whether or not students will want to enroll in a four-year college, if they're not going to be able to take classes in person. There have been a lot of concerns expressed, and I'm wondering how, since you are engaged in these discourses around science and the production of knowledge, and you think about technology and the humanities in conversation with each other, how have you thought at all about how the way we're utilizing digital technology during this moment of crisis might affect our our public spaces or our educational spaces when this is over?
Oh, I think that the thing I worry about much more is what I presume to be a coming economic aftershock that may make 2008 look puny. I mean, that's what I'm really worried about.
So you're not thinking about the effects. You're not thinking about the transformation of technology.
No. I'm thinking about
immediately.
I think it was yesterday that Brown announced a hiring freeze for staff and faculty. I mean,
yes.
I'm so like I think there are interesting conversations to have about the ways in which technology. I know you're sort of nudging us in this direction. Shifts publicness and privacy. We can totally talk about that. But I'll just say for the record that what I'm worried about more is that what scant financial support there is for the kinds of work you and I do, I think is quite likely about to really take a very serious hit. I'm not worried about institutions like Bard and Wesleyan moving on to Zoom for many classes in some kind of more permanent way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not worried about the return of the MOOC because the MOOC moment 10 years ago had such uncertain outcomes. People didn't seem to stick with MOOCs very much. I think that the information we have about MOOC teaching suggests that it might be useful for certain kinds of people in certain kinds of circumstances. I like to tune into lectures on YouTube sometimes when there's something like, for example, the English language historical etymology that I'm curious about, that I really want to dig into. But I'm a privileged person who's the beneficiary of an education that helps me to process information like that. I'm not trying to get a college education from those lectures.
Right.
So I'm not experiencing paranoia about how this is actually the secret road test of Zoom to replace us all with digital avatars of ourselves. That's not where my anxieties go. My anxieties are much more about the coming economic shock.
Yeah.
How about you?
Where are my anxieties?
Well, I mean, where are your prognostications?
How much time do you have?
Yeah.
I don't have any prognostications. I think one of the reasons I wanted to do this experiment and to create this record is because I realized that for me, it's going to take a long time to process what's happening to us right now, that I don't think I'm capable of saying anything, writing anything profound in this moment that offers, searing analysis or critique of how this is going to radically transform the world around us. I find myself having lots of surprising thoughts that are new and unexpected and conditioned by the radical shift in our daily lives. My anxieties are with my friends, honestly. I think, just to be totally blunt, I was talking to one of my best friends earlier who's a yoga teacher in Heidelberg, and when I moved there for postdoc work several years ago, she hired me to teach classes to supplement my stipend income. And she has gone from teaching 10 hours of classes a day between group and privates to none. And that's her livelihood. And the studio is closed for the foreseeable future. And, she's a yoga teacher, so she wasn't making that much money. Yeah. And, so my anxieties are reaching out to my friends and just seeing what they need. I'm very reticent to use the language of privilege, but I can honestly say this is the first time in my life where I really, I didn't grow up in in, you know, in an economically privileged home in any way, but I feel very privileged right now. I do. I get to keep doing my work. My income and healthcare have not been affected. You know, as you said, I get to keep doing most of the daily things that I've been doing. And I'm trying to see this moment as an invitation to think, to, you know, to really embrace Arendt's axiom to stop and think. And, you know, I have a lot of anxieties. My personal motto is embrace despair, and it feels incredibly apt right now for me. But that was a long answer to a personal question in a public space.
No, it was much appreciated. I mean, similarly, when I think about what's happening to restaurant and cafe and bar workers right now,
Yeah.
I've been trying to look at my budget and think, what do I spend on those kinds of services each week and month, and trying to spend the same thing on those places I know that can do delivery, or use Venmo to tip baristas I know and stuff like that. There's this kind of, which feels extremely feeble. You know, it feels like a very feeble effort to get some kind of emergency money to people who are really have a less stable income than I. I mean, we're having this conversation about teaching on Zoom, and that's very relevant to our own lives, but in a broader picture, we're lucky we get to keep doing this. We're very fortunate. So stopping and thinking is really an intriguing way to look at this. And earlier you talked about feeling like you can't theorize this moment. I don't want you to put words in your mouth, but you were saying that you don't feel like you have writerly traction on what we're going through. And I don't either. And I was thinking to myself, thinking in public ended with a meditation on time.
Mm-hmm.
It ended with a meditation on the different temporality between philosophical work and political work. And that's one I really believe in. I agree with Arendt that to think you need to stop. And that has both good and bad consequences.
Yeah.
It means that the kind of scholarly work that I do isn't journalism. And I don't try to keep pace with contemporary events. When I write cultural criticism, it isn't with an eye towards contemporary relevance. I'm an ardent anti-instrumentalist in my intellectual life, possibly to my professional detriment, but I don't care. Those are the standards I live by. I feel like I have to. So, it's possible to imagine writing about this in a year or two. It's not possible for me to imagine writing about this right now in any effective way. I've been keeping a little diary of the odd things that happen, like the way in a Zoom conversation, if you cough or laugh, Zoom might want to shift the camera and mic back to you to sort of Zoom has these quirks.
Yeah.
As a space. As if the spotlight is suddenly on you.
I'm watching our green box now bounce
back and
forth. Yeah. Yeah. It's I think Sheldon Woolen, who was a great political thinker, may he rest in peace, who died several years ago, now has this essay on political theory as invocation, in which he's thinking about the turn of the century, and he wrote 20 years ago. And oh no, I'm hitting that age where I'm starting, like, the years are mush, I think. But he has this, he talks about how thinking has succumbed to the 24/7 news cycle, and how we've lost leisure in thinking and in doing the work of political theory, to write slow work, because everybody has to write the hot take, the think piece.
Yeah.
That's really, and you know,
Denkstück? How do you say that? Denkstück? I don't know.
think, how would you think, yeah, I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Denkstück. And you know, now it feels, there's an interesting tension because everybody's writing something, but there's also this, I think, awareness that we really have no idea what we're experiencing or how it's going to change things for us in the future. And I mean, I think it's an invitation, but it feels like an indictment to me on the way we've been writing somehow. Not all of us, but some of us, perhaps.
So I tend to very much be in the camp that you are sort of identifying yourself in through Woolman. But let me try to just play the devil's advocate for a second and ask, is it okay? Is it not okay that there's a media circus and that people who write for, not just for newspapers, but for all kinds of online forums, need to write takes, and they need to be really searing hot to capture attention. And that there is nevertheless a world of people who write for slower things that get fewer clicks, and that
Absolutely.
potentially coexistent.
I think so. You know, the point actually, as the publication comes to mind when you say that, I feel like that's an incredible example of public thinking that doesn't really do a lot of, you know, they do have like an online space where they publish more, you know, current things, but you know, and I feel like the LA Review of Books has been doing a nice public, offering a nice public space for slow think pieces. But
No.
I mean, and there are, you know, but there, it's really, I'm trying to like think, what are those publications that I reach for? Are there ones that you are like going to that feel like they're nourishing your ability to think right now in this onslaught of digital news media and takes?
I mean, to be very boringly honest about this,
Yes,
I
please.
turn to physical books. I mean,
You just shut down the computer,
well,
and you just, I love it. Yeah.
I feel like I'm not trying, I don't want to pretend that I don't use a computer or I'm not on the internet all the time, because, you know, I'm in a world of people who are, but reading physical books by preference when I can helps a lot in this.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because having text in front of me that is not connected to my email is extremely happy making for me. But I mean, this is also a question about who I'm reading and who you're reading and who we find helpful. I think the answer is that the 24/7 news cycle, and made much worse, you know, 16 years after Wolin's essay, by the election of a president who keeps everybody jumping because he's unpredictable. You know, my editor at the University of California Press told me Ben, frankly, whenever we release your book, there's every chance that some disaster will drown out any news coverage of it. And I think, okay, I understand. That's the world we're in now. Okay, but I like to read book reviews.
Yeah.
Whether they're of sort of pressing big hit books that are likely to get into the New York Times, or whether they're of books like the ones that I write that tend to have a smaller audience and be reviewed in places like the LA Review of Books, if they're reviewed publicly at all, outside of academic journals. And the reason I like that is because it's a genre, the book review, that captures this kind of being slightly out of step with current events that you're describing. So I find that I'm not somebody who tries to shroud himself in the news at all, but in my online life, I very rarely comment on contemporary public events. I don't wear my political opinions on my sleeve very much. And it's partly because there are other people who just do that more ardently and better than I could. And it's also because I like being a little bit out of step with my times. I think that a little bit of anachronism is healthy. In part because it does that thing that Arendt encourages us to do, which is to find some space for thinking and to stop a little bit.
Yeah. So I want, since you brought up your online persona, which is rather charming, if I may say so. Your Twitter persona is full of puns and humor, and you're very generous and always promoting other people and sharing things, which I greatly appreciate. But we had a little exchange. I don't even remember when it was. And I sent you the Auden poem that you recited earlier. And I feel like I have to ask you the question, which I didn't ask you on Twitter, because you said that was the secret thesis to the entire book. And I was like, I know something. I was like, what is the secret thesis? And so, I mean, you can recite the poem again if it's a short. I shared it a few days ago actually because it felt really relevant somehow to our moment.
It's so striking because it's decades before Auden and Arendt are friends, right? It's 1932. I may have been being tongue-in-cheek, which is something I like to do because you're being very generous to me. I just tell a lot of silly jokes and make silly puns on Twitter. It's what I like to do. But I think that just to review it again, private faces in public places are wiser and nicer than public faces in private places.
Yes.
So,
which is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek poem.
Well, so it raises the question, is a private face by implication somebody who doesn't necessarily make of themselves a public character?
Doesn't it transform into a persona that appears in public?
Because when we appear in public, we tend to take on a certain shtickiness. There's an implication of insincerity about
that. Yeah.
And it seems that you could read Auden as saying that he is choosing sincerity over the seeming insincerity of the mass queerer. And for those of us who, do things like be sincere in public, there's something flat, sort of maybe flattering about that interpretation of the autumn.
So the way that you're reading it reminds me of Hannah Arendt's use of René Char, the French poet and resistance fighter, and her use of hypnos waking, his wartime diary, that she cites at the end of On Revolution, at the beginning of Between Past and Future, and in thinking about the line that she goes to is, our inheritance was left to us by no testament. But at the end of On Revolution, she has these beautiful passages where I'm not going to get them completely right, but she says, he realized that he had lost his treasure. What was the treasure? That he could go free, that he could appear naked as he was, without any disguise, that he could truly be himself, that there was something about the condition of that time of fighting in the resistance, of being able to appear in public naked without any of that affect or persona, and to act in a way that is closer perhaps to I think, I want to say being, but it seems, I think, and that raises a question about Arendt and the relationship between poetry as the form that's closest to thinking, and how poetry appears in the world as a thing. And Auden here giving us a picture of a private person appearing in public, as opposed to having the reverse happen.
It also seems so idealistic in a certain way. I mean, doesn't it? Like this idea, this dream that we could actually be ourselves in public life, and that we're not going to be.
Yeah.
The idea that
break it down. There's no third wall in the conversation.
I mean, there's something so naive about, almost willfully naive about the idea that Char could just be himself in public life. So in the same way that when I say things in public settings, whether I'm giving a talk or I'm on social media, I may be trying to be very sincere, but there is some aspect of self-presentation going on, even when the thought of that makes me a little antsy or uncomfortable, and it makes me not want to go to Twitter for several days. I guess I'm just sort of, I'm enough Freudian to think that ideas about getting to our true self and sharing our true self with others seem to me kind of comical, because I'm not even that much. I can't be that much in touch with my true self myself in private in the first place.
Well, we men of knowledge, we do not even know ourselves.
Yeah. So. But I do think that there's a kind of we could view this in terms of degree rather than kind. That there's degrees of shtickiness and degrees of performance, and also degrees of trying not to do that.
Do you?
You have.
I'm curious if you, as a public intellectual, as a cultural and social anthropologist, as somebody who's very much an observer of our contemporary times, do you feel, I'm wondering what the shtickiness is, right? Because, there's no, so in private, I, in talking to you, am entirely confident that you're a thoughtful and brilliant person. And I learned something from all of our exchanges, and you provoke me to think. And, but I've never seen you give a public lecture, right? And I think, the kind of the goal of, like when I give public lectures, the only hope I have is that I cause people to think about something. I'm happy to be wrong. I don't, I'm wondering what that stickiness is and why we feel the necessity to do it, and why it has such a high commodity value on the market of public intellectual work.
Yeah, okay. I want to try to answer that by speaking to something slightly different, but related. But I should say that I certainly I don't identify myself as a public intellectual. And I don't have that kind of I don't think I have the kind of volume and listenership, et cetera, that term might imply. But I simply have the fortune to be able to write and to know enough people who are willing to publish what I write. Whereas you have a Rentian Twitter account with an actual fan following. No, you do. But the
I just live tweet what I'm working on during the day. I really think that's how boring my life is.
No, there's something that's very beautiful. But I think that the thing that I really want to do when I'm speaking to audiences, academic or general public, or writing for audiences, academic or general public, is show people myself reaching for something that's a little outside my grasp, beyond my grasp, or struggling with something that's hard for them, so that they can join me.
Yeah.
And either they will show me something that I hadn't seen, they'll show me that it's simpler than I think it is, or they'll show me a different way of looking at it entirely. I find that very gratifying.
Yeah.
I think that I remember a time when we assumed that people weren't brands, and that a brand was a sneaker company.
What a sad sentence.
That I'm not invited to think of myself as having a brand and of saying certain things that would be considered off-brand. And I remember being in graduate school, and I was in graduate school. I had been working in restaurant kitchens before graduate school, and I was working sometimes as a food writer on the side as a graduate student, which I really loved and continue to love doing. And I remember people commenting on what I was doing, that I was sort of splitting my attention or writing about too many different topics. And now I think this was a long time ago now, it's getting on 20 years ago. And now I think people would just say it's off-brand. You're supposed to have a brand. And
right.
This makes me so antsy, but maybe it speaks to the question you asked about stickiness, about how some of the things we say are sticky, some of the things we say are designed to reinforce a certain impression of us in the eyes of some ambiguous public.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, again, it reminds me of Adorno. And the way in which we commodify ourselves and turn ourselves into things that have a certain exchange value in a marketplace of ideas. And that, I feel like this seeps into contemporary political theory and philosophy, and the way that everybody is now expected to produce a concept, and that's what makes you marketable. I remember when I was in, you know, every, like, coin a phrase or a term that explains something. When I was in graduate school, I was on a hiring committee, and I was at a graduate student lunch with the faculty candidate, and we were going around the room, and everybody was saying what their areas of concentration were and what they were writing their dissertations on. And it got to me, and I said, I'm I study historical political theory and contemporary political theory, and I'm interested in love, sadomasochism, and melancholia. And and, and this woman just like went sheet white and stared at me, and like took a second, and she said, she said, uh, she said, in total deadpan, she said, "You're not marketable." And I said, "Good," and I've succeeded. I don't want to be marketable. That's not why I'm here. That's not what's fueling me. And I think that's for me, that there were a couple of others, but that for me was one of the moments where any commitment I had to academia just broke.
Well, it's an uncommonly healthy response to the proposition that our intellectual lives should fit inside the structures of the academy. But there are many confusions. There are many confusions that organized academic life visits upon us. And but one of them is the idea, first of all, that there is a market for academic work, which I think it's more akin to a lottery. And
a meritocracy lottery?
No, there's no meritocracy. We know that's pretty much a myth too. But in fact, I often describe the fact that I'm not in a tenure track job as the failure of nepotism.
Nice. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
I think for this particular public, maybe off the record later.
Okay.
But
Okay.
so,
in the private.
In the private, yeah. So no, which I do believe in. I do believe in the private. I wrote a book called Thinking in Public, but it's not a celebration of publicness. It's sort of
yes.
In what I thought was a comical moment, and this is to illustrate a different confusion that academic life sometimes visits on us. In a comical moment in a review of my advisor Martin Jay's book, Songs of Experience.
Oh, yes.
Terry Eagleton, in the pages of, I believe, the London Review of Books, wrote something like, this is a good book, but it's not going to help us get George Bush out of office. And the notion seemed to be that Martin Jay, associated with the intellectual history of Western Marxism, somehow should be writing books that have a discrete political effect. It seemed to me almost like spit wine out of your nose laughable, right? That both in terms of its ascription to academic theorizing particular political effects, and its sheer view that a primarily scholarly project should be measured against the horizon of political effects, which is something of which I'm always very skeptical. And this is just, if the sort of round of introductions that you were describing bespeaks one of the kinds of confusion, that we should always be marketing ourselves in a certain way.
Right.
Another related confusion is that the ways we're marketable are related to a set of instrumental effects.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember, and you highlight this really nicely in your book, that we're not subject to uncontrollable historical processes. We are making the historical conditions of the moment that we're living in. We are active participants in the structures and systems that, you know, we often talk about in an elusive way. But I think there's, you know, there are a lot of political thinkers who I think write in the way that Eagleton was suggesting in that review, and that's their desire. Like, they are writing essays or books that they hope will propel them into positions of policy making or advising that can have an effect on the political institutional structures that shape our lives in many ways. But the idea that you know, an academic work or a work of contemplation or meditation or critique or analysis is supposed to bear on you know, that kind of political situation necessarily seems horribly vulgar to me, to be blunt. And it seems like an example of what we were talking about earlier about the difference between knowledge production and the work of understanding.
Yeah, yeah. But I this is just giving me so many flashbacks to Berkeley seminars as I was a graduate student at Berkeley, where
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
the flashbacks.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not a drug user, so these are the only flashbacks I got. The feeling in many seminars was that you were supposed to walk in not with questions, but with answers that served a particular politics.
Yeah.
And this was true of many of the departments in the social sciences and the humanities. And it was, frankly, a really boring version of intellectual life.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that's happened, and I think that some people, you mentioned the Los Angeles Review of Books and The Point earlier, and I think that people writing for those magazines, people writing for Hedgehog Review, people writing for a lot of different publications right now, have been in an effort to map out a non-vanguardist territory,
Mm-hmm.
Which is, I think, praiseworthy. And it's like trying to create space for thinking and commentary rather than assuming that the necessary horizon line is one of political contestation. Of course, the things we do are intimately political in different ways. They're informed by our political views and our political perspectives. They happen against a background of world events that we didn't choose.
Mm-hmm.
You and I and 7.8 billion other people are in a circumstance that none of us would choose right now. Well, actually, wait, I'm sure there's somebody.
You want to hold open the possibility.
Human possibility.
Absolutely. No, it's a great, you know, it's a catch mechanism in thinking that moves you away from concretizing or crystallizing you know, and I think, and then you know, it's a very Arendtian impulse. So I deeply appreciate it.
You're being more eloquent about this than me. I was thinking about Woody Allen's idea for a game show called Human Beings Wow.
I think we're living that right now.
Yeah, we absolutely
Woody
are.
Allen might be an actor in that play right now, unfortunately.
No, the thought that we might all be in, you know, we might think we're in infinite space, but we're in fact bounded by Woody Allen's nutshell as a dark.
Oh, yeah, okay, all right. Okay, then I want to ask you. One last question. We'll see. I might have a follow up, but you know, it's so pleasurable. I want to keep talking with you, but I feel like we've way gone past the half-hour mark that I promised you. So, do you think there's a space for public intellectuals right now and where is it, and what, where can people go in this moment to be nourished in thinking?
Oh, I hope you don't think that this is just me sucking up, because you're part of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and it's an institution, nonprofit organization that does adult education, and it's not designed to create platforms for public intellectuals. It's not a kind of a public outreach program for any particular political party. It's not designed to generate solidarity between its teachers in a particular political struggle. And I've never had the opportunity to take a class at Visser, and I just happen to know some of the teachers. But I admire this work enormously. It's a form of non-public intellectual life that I really, really admire, because it's trying to help people find intellectual resources to have their own life of the mind. And I'm not at all interested in public intellectuals or people who would resonate with that frequency and want to use that term made possible by Russell Jacoby's book, The Last Intellectuals. Was it 1987? It's the same year as Alan Bloom published The Closing of the American Mind. It's this great kind of juxtaposing moment in American intellectual history. We will have people who want public platforms, whether it's the sort of micrological public platform of Twitter or the public platform of trade publication and the conference talk circuit. I want us to be better and more skeptical consumers of that kind of public intellectual life. I want us to challenge ourselves and live more richly in our own heads. I want to write things that are challenging and read things that are challenging, rather than read things that gratify my expectations for intellectual life to be as I expect it to be. That's what I want. I mean, I inspired by friends this year, I've been going through my first sort of adult reading of Proust. The first time in my life I've been trying to go through the whole text of Recherche de Trompe-l'œil. And what I really love about the experience is partly the beauty of the prose, but also the surprises, the reality of periods of boredom in a text that has been presented to me as potentially transformative, and that I have to deal with the fact that having the experience of having with this text differs radically from a certain cartoonish portrayal of Proust as a writer who will change my life.
Right.
And I love this. I like those kinds of surprises. And I would feel privileged to share those kinds of surprises with others.
Yeah.
That's not exactly a direct answer to your question.
Well, it is. I think it is. Direct answers are often not as interesting as the indirect ones, I think. But you're pointing toward a kind of, so if we think of public intellectual as a crystallized term that signals a certain form of writing or performing for a public audience, that's one thing. But I think we're at a place right now where we desperately need genuinely thoughtful voices who are doing the work of real critique And, you know, critique from the, you know, I think that the root from the Greek is, you know, is the krisis, which is literally means a kind of gestalt shift. So grave is to force a turning point, you know, an ability, you know, we need, and there are people who are doing this. I'm not saying there aren't. And the people who are doing it feel like a life raft to me right now, but
Who are they?
it doesn't feel like, it doesn't feel like, it doesn't feel like that's, you know, that's not the mainstream. And, you know, one of the things that we've been wrestling with since Trump's election is this complete, you know, this collapse between fact and fiction, and the ability to discern what's true from what's false, and this language of fake news. And I feel like these two things go hand in hand together. Like, I feel like our loss of judgment and our ability to engage in critique as a society is tied up with the way in which a lot of public intellectual work is being done today.
Yeah. Okay. This is a very helpful reorientation. But can I, just to help me think with you about this, is there a name you could offer of somebody who you think?
I don't want to, I don't think, I'm not really, I mean, there are names of people that come to mind, but I'm reticent to give a list. Maybe I'll include a couple links when I post the conversation. You know, I think a lot of the people who I see doing this kind of thinking are often the kind of people who don't get a big public audience, who aren't necessarily always even inclined to publish, and who do their work in other spaces.
Yeah, it's interesting. This may go back to the issue of branding too, and stickiness, that sometimes the people doing the most interesting thinking for me are the people who aren't inclined to brand what they do,
Mm-hmm.
or aren't inclined to present what they do as a form of intellectual life in the first place.
Right.
And because I spend a lot of time in the food world, I found myself thinking a couple of years ago about my favorite restaurant critic, who was named Jonathan Gold, who very sadly passed a little while ago. He's a Los Angeles restaurant critic who wrote very beautiful criticism, that reviews of restaurants that were almost elegies to a way of inhabiting the city, Los Angeles. And I thought that what he did was a kind of intellectual life that isn't usually appreciated as such. And there are film critics and book critics who do this too.
Yes.
Who, maybe because they're not political theorists and they're not writing articles about Trump's latest mistake in the London Review of Books, they're not presenting what they do as an intervention in contemporary political discourse. But it's nevertheless a really crucial resource for those who want to think critically about politics.
Yes.
Because it models a different way of thinking. And this may seem almost comical, but I find that the things that help me to think clearly about our contemporary political situation are very often not things from the world of direct political commentary.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense to me, and I certainly don't get my grounding from those pieces either. And it's I think lately I've been going back to the texts that I have always kind of held onto as texts to think with that make me feel at home in the world, because I feel, you know, thrown into this moment. So let me end with this question, since we're going to have lots of false endings, apparently. Is there anything you're holding on to right now, aside from Proust?
Such a lovely question, and of course now I'm treading water as I reach for the life raft of an answer to it. There are things that I read that I find aesthetically steadying in this time. And there are also people who I think are really interesting and intelligent voices. I'm a big fan of the work of the writer Rebecca Solnit, but I'm not necessarily a fan of her explicitly political writing, actually. And she's had this, as you know, she's had this really interesting career trajectory in which she's written a lot on the arts, a lot on personal experience, and a lot on politics, and a lot on activism. And these days, most of what she does falls into the latter area. And she's been a really important voice in public, and certainly somebody people would label a public intellectual. But the portions of her work that I really love are her books about, you know, the photographer Edward Muybridge, or the experience of walking, and her appreciation of the political dimensions of things like photography and perambulation. That's what I find sort of steadying. And she is somebody whose work I could reach for now in a steadying way. I reach for, in different ways, things that are key texts for me and always have been. The Odyssey. And I've been having a really interesting time over the last couple of years going through the Emily Wilson translation, which I think is a really interesting translation. Not that I have the Greek to really know.
If you have the Greek, yeah.
Yeah, I have some Greek, but not enough Homeric Greek to really read the whole thing. And I can kind of juxtapose her translation to the Fitzgerald, which is the translation I grew up with and that I really adore. And these are things that I cleave to. I'm just taking them as examples, not because they are for me answers to contemporary predicaments, but because they're the kinds of things that have always made me feel like I'm engaged with myself as a thinking being as I read them, which to me is really gratifying.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's so nice.
Thank you for answering it, and thank you for participating in this little experience of recording our contemporary moment, however we're experiencing it. So I hope to see you soon when all of this is over, and please be safe.
Likewise, be safe. Thank you so much.